Will you ever be satisfied with where you are, or is aiming higher simply going to cause dissatisfaction when you don't reach it? And if so, is it actually worth it? Or is there simply a smarter, better way to go about being ambitious that lets you have both? Yoichi's backstory of his silver medalist parents is so interesting to me because Blue Lock has always been a story about aiming for number one because nothing else matters, or at the very least, that's the philosophy of the man behind the project, Jinpachi Ego. But I always loved when a series isn't afraid to explore the flip side of its own message. It's part of why Blue Lock is so phenomenal. Of course, the prime example is Uber's master Mark Snuffy, known for winning 4 out of the 5 major European leagues, and in a complete shock to me at the time, is actually regarded as the best player in the world, even by Noel Noah, who up until this point was shown as the absolute greatest, the final target that everyone should be aiming for. But Snuffy's philosophy is incredibly different to everything else we've seen in Blue Lock, and yet the author chose to make him the first player that Noah didn't have an answer for. He chose to make Snuffy the best out there, which I've always thought was a really interesting decision and something the series will come back to at some point. But it's no coincidence that this is the match where Hiori finally gets a significant role. Honestly, at the time this chapter came out, I think a lot of the fanbase, myself included, didn't remember who this guy was. As mentioned, his mother and father were national silver medalists in high jump and judo respectively, and to appease their regrets at not coming first, they want their child to become a top athlete. And this has always been wild to me. You know, I completely get the frustration of pouring your soul into something and then still losing out. And I asked you guys in a community post about this, and you all gave me a ton of IRL examples of this happening. So I absolutely do get their frustrations. You know, when I lose a volleyball match and I play at the lowest level you can possibly imagine, I feel super frustrated. And obviously it's 100 times worse for these guys, so I absolutely do get it. But Hiori's parents have incredible accomplishments. And if anyone told you that they were pissed off with having a silver instead of a gold, what would you say to them? Right, not at the time, obviously, as we just went through, but if it got to the point where years down the line, it's still not only weighing on them, but taking over both their lives and their sons well over a decade later, I mean, presumably closer to 2 decades later, you'd probably tell them that they were being crazy, right? Instead, they should be celebrating what they've accomplished. But Hiori's parents are attempting to live vicariously through him, raising him to become the best football player in the world. I'm not really sure why they chose football instead of one of the sports they're an expert in, or at least something like kind of related. Football seems kind of random here. And also, he got all of his mum's genes. His dad's genes did not stand a chance. But anyway, they devote their everything into raising Hiori to be the best, training him every day, cheering him on, and on the surface, it seems kind of wholesome. They just want the best for their kids, but Hiori honestly isn't interested in the sport that much. You know, he just kind of goes along with it because it makes them happy, and obviously, like, he's just a kid going along with what his parents say. But obviously, given the intro, that's not the case. Their frustrations build at each other due to him not having the making of the world's number one. And as their arguments intensify, Hiori catches things that no child ever wants to hear. Why do you think I married you in the first place? Our lives will have been wasted if he ends up as a half-assed athlete. If he doesn't become the world's best, we're getting divorced. But of course, the cherry on top being when he falls down the stairs and injures his leg. They don't even look at him. They just look at his leg. They have no interest in him as a person. Their only concern is that this injury might stop him playing. He is essentially nothing but a tool for them to patch up their regrets. But not knowing what else to do, he continues to keep playing, seeing himself as a character in a game, pushing forward in spite of how hollow it all feels, never questioning much until his meeting with Karasu, who admired Hiori's skill but saw right through his act. His complete lack of passion for the sport was obvious, but he'd simply never questioned what else he could do. He'd never considered setting his own expectations for himself, or what he'd do if his parents weren't around. And I think this is the crux of why they ended up this way. And something that just clicked for me now actually is that this is the exact same thing that Jinpachi is doing. For whatever reason, his football career ended whilst his rival Noah rose to number 1. And so now he's a ghost trying to create the world's next number 1 in the next generation. And again, I think it's no coincidence that we find this out just 2 chapters before Hiyori's backstory. Given that not a single person at Blue Lock recognizes Jinpachi, and he's now 31, he's probably been holding on to whatever it is for a similar length of time as Hiyori's parents. None of them could see a life for themselves outside of being number 1. They were completely set on this idea, and so when it didn't work out for them, they've resorted to this very twisted way of going around it. And Blue Lock hammers home the dangers of not being able to see a life for yourself outside of one specific goal in one of the most shocking chapters I've seen in a sports manga, where we see the fate of Snuffy's friend who fought exactly that way and went as far as to end his own life. Of course, we see an eerily similar train of thought from Isagi in 295. If I'm not number 1, then it's meaningless. And don't worry, I don't expect a similar ending, but I've had this growing thought for a while now about what Isagi will feel when he becomes the greatest striker in the world. Because when you feel obligated to achieve something, as he now seems to, in my experience, it doesn't really bring any satisfaction when you reach it, just a kind of momentary bit of relief. But again, I don't think this is going to happen to Isagi, so where am I going with this side tangent? After being invited to the Blue Lock program and making it through to the Neo Egoist League, Hiyori doesn't really do anything for a long time. But in the midst of the match against Ubers, with Snuffy shutting down Isagi's attacks, Hiyori sees a way through. Remember how I mentioned that his parents came from 2 pretty unrelated sports, judo and high jump? The moment Hiyori spots something is when Snuffy, the man with a black belt in jujutsu, clears the ball with a high jump. What is significant though is Hiyori finally being proactive and standing up to the man he was quite literally born to defeat, after he initially denied Isagi's request to substitute him on. And interestingly, after watching Bauer up close and thinking to himself that he simply doesn't have the kind of qualities that the world's best striker would have, he instead decides that he wants to make Yoichi a king, and that he's playing because only he holds the key to his awakening, which is obviously incredibly similar to his parents, but we'll come back to that. Isagi and Hiyori both gambled their future on the team, on their results here, with Isagi essentially relying on Hiyori to make something happen as he can't on his own, dragging Hiyori into that old feeling his parents put on him. And this is where I want to go back to that intro of never being satisfied. Because obviously we look at this and think of, parental expectations, parents telling their kids they have to achieve this and be this, etc. But I don't think it has to come from just that. It's incredibly easy nowadays to do this to ourselves, to become dead set on having to reach something for even not so great reasons, or not even really understanding why we want it. And that's not always a bad thing, but of course through Mick Moon, Hiyori's parents, etc., sometimes it just really doesn't do any good. And this is where a very interesting, extremely difficult question comes up that I won't pretend to fully or even remotely know the answer to, in that at what point does aiming higher or being completely set on a certain goal just start to become a net negative for you? If Mick Moon hadn't been so set on winning all 5 major leagues and becoming number 1 in the world, he'd probably still be here. If Hiyori's parents weren't so fixated on this idea of being number 1, they probably wouldn't have spent the last 16, 17 years miserable and arguing, stressing over Hiyori's progress, and of course, he wouldn't have had to live such a miserable life. And obviously this isn't always super black and white. I know for me at least that having some degree of expectations for myself did a lot of good. Back when I had none and was just playing League of Legends all day, every day, I was miserable, right? But also, if you've been here a while, you've probably noticed my videos have really changed a lot over the last 2.5 years. In the earlier stages, I spoke a lot about my subscriber goal and how it pushed me forward and stopped me lounging around all day. And that was brilliant for when I wanted to be more productive. It definitely worked, right? But it kind of reached a point where I was honestly working too much, right, and neglecting other areas of my life for it. And it might sound a little crazy, but me saying that, when you look at my upload rate and things, but do bear in mind, obviously, I work full time, got other things going on. and these videos do just take a lot of work. But that's why I've not mentioned any sort of sub goal this year, because I feel like I'm now at the point where I'm beyond the point of feeling like I'm not productive enough. You know that awful feeling when like you wish you were doing something? Like, I'm kind of well past that stage. I spend, the majority of the time where I'm not working on this channel and I really enjoy it, and I'm pleased with how productive I am with it. And so it doesn't really matter to me whether I finish on 150, 160, 170,000 subscribers. Certainly not as much as like looking after myself and doing some other things I've wanted to do for a long time, like playing more volleyball, etc. I'll come to how to link to Hiori in a second, but just before that, I've mentioned that I'm probably not going to be making a ton more Blue Lock videos in the near future. I'm just focusing on some other series for a bit, but I am still doing the weekly reads on my Patreon, so go check that out if you're interested. Thank you to Jean Carlos, Karina Hernandez, Benjamin Weir, and Sheboygan for signing up in the last week or so. But the whole point of all of that is what Hiori says here, that he was scared if he lost soccer, no one would want to love him anymore. It doesn't have to be exactly that reasoning, but he was terrified of giving this pursuit up, both because of how those around him might respond, and because he just had no idea what else to do. He'd never made a choice until now because he never felt like there was one. He felt completely locked into this path laid out for him. And obviously trying to weigh all of this up in the middle of such a difficult match is pretty overwhelming for him. He's asking himself if it's fine for him to follow Isagi's expectations for him, or whether he should follow Jinpachi's of being a striker instead. In the end, opting to shoot himself as kind of an act of rebellion against it all, feeling of having made some sort of decision for himself. But after the shot misses, we get a really interesting scene of him essentially giving up on the sport, believing himself someone who wasn't born to play soccer, in spite of the fact that from the Uber's point of view, he's an absolute menace at it. And this is probably the result of Jinpachi's vision and his parents' vision kind of intersecting. His parents want him to become the best in the world, and Jinpachi has laid out what he believes that looks like. Because Hiori didn't match that description, he's not this powerhouse revolutionary striker like Bauer right in front of him, he sees no future in the sport. He can't see any reason to keep playing. He doesn't have a vision for himself playing outside of that. And obviously the idea of two people's visions intersecting is what leads to the final goal of this match, but we'll come back to that. But it's also quite interesting that this is what's finally given him the courage to tell his parents he doesn't want to keep playing, which I suspect is down to him thinking that they'd accept it like this. He's got some kind of evidence in his eyes that he can't live up to their expectations. But the big question is, if he's going to leave the sport behind, what would he do next? What does he actually want for himself, and how does he even begin to figure that out? Obviously, it's not something that there's really a blanket answer for, right? But I'm sure there'll be something outside of football that he enjoys. But of course, that's not what ends up happening. With Isagi telling him to join him for one last play, Hiori finds himself strangely fired up, weirdly energized by the prospect of seeing if Isagi really is the real deal he's claimed to be. And it feels incredibly natural to him. For the first time, it's like my body and mind are aligned, resulting in him and Isagi pulling off a phenomenal goal where they both sync their intentions without even looking at each other. But I don't actually want to spend super long on the goal itself, because in terms of this video there isn't a ton to say. Instead, I want to finish off with their discussion afterwards and how much happier Hiori feels afterwards. Now that he's no longer just set on becoming number one because he feels like he has to, but is instead just looking at the aspect of the game that he enjoys in spite of what his parents or Jinpachi told him, i.e. producing the world's best striker with his soccer, which is actually exactly what his parents were trying to do, but regardless. It's like he's suddenly started enjoying the sport for the first time, and that's something he likely never would have done had he continued to follow what his parents wanted from him. And as I said near the start, I really don't think this just had to apply to parental expectations at all. Obviously there's so many nuances and exceptions here that I really can't put out some sort of one-size-fits-all answer. But all I can say is that in my experience, just asking yourself why you are so set on something, and whether or not there's an answer outside of that, will be one of the best things you ever do.